As a part of our ongoing closet to mudroom renovation, we want to add a built-in bench with storage and sliding doors. Let's figure out one way to make it. Like with any plywood project, we start by using the circular saw to rip down full sheets into oversized panels. Use a straight edge and a high tooth count blade for the best possible cuts here. I'm using an aluminum straight edge and an 80 tooth blade. Don't forget to measure the distance between your saw's blade and the edge of the plate. This is the distance away from your line you need to set your straight edge. The top and bottom of this bench are too long to cut to finished length on my table saw, so I'm again using my circular saw. I know these need to be exactly the same length, so to minimize human error, I clamp both panels together and cut them in one pass. With the oversized panels cut, I move over to the table saw and cut all the pieces to their final length and width. I make sure to batch these cuts together so that I need to reset the fence as few times as possible. This project uses a bunch of Dadoes and Rabbets, both for its joinery and for the sliding doors, and we're going to make all of these cuts using the router. I lay my top and bottom panels front to front and mark out all my cuts. First, I mark out 2 3/4 inch rabbets, one on each side of each panel. These will be the rabbets that my side panels eventually fit into. Next, I mark out 2 3/4 inch dados for the interior dividers. These dados need to stop 2.5 inches from the front of the bench, so that we can install the doors later and not have to see this exposed joinery. This bench will have 3 sliding doors, which means we need to have 3 1/4 inch tracks, all spaced out 1/2 inch apart. I mark these lines and then I fill them in so that I can be sure to align my router with the correct lines. I grab my router, get it set up in its plunging base, and start with a 3/4 inch mortising bit. I set the depth to 1/8 of an inch and make my first pass. Then I drop it down to 3/8 of an inch and make a second and final pass. When I route using a straight edge, a corner of my router often tries to pull away from the straight edge, causing inconsistencies in my line. To avoid this, try to have even pressure on both handles of the router. Make sure that your router speed is set high enough to move smoothly, and that you're taking shallow enough passes each time that the bit isn't getting hung up on an abundance of material. I switch to a 1/4 inch bit and start to cut the rails for my doors. These rails go the full length of the panels. The top one gets cut at 3/8 of an inch deep, while the bottom only gets cut to 1/8 of an inch. And finally, I switch to a 1/2 inch rabbeting bit. These bits have a bearing that rides on the bottom of your workpiece and guides the cutting head. No need for a straight edge to get a consistent cut with this type of bit. I cut this rabbet into the top, bottom, and both side panels. The back panel will set into the recess made here. My center dividers won't fit into place with the rounded edges that the router left. To fix this, I grab my chisels and straighten up this edge. Before glue up, I do a dry fit of the bench so that I can make sure everything fits together how it should, and so that I can get an accurate measurement for my back panel. I like to wait to cut the back panel until I get a real-life measurement from the project, as the actual dimensions are usually slightly different than the original plans. This project is getting edge banded, and most of that will happen later after the bench is assembled, but these interior dividers will be hard to access then, so we're adding the edge banding to them now. Edge banding is installed using an iron to activate the glue, then adding pressure to it until it cools, and finally trimming the excess. I add glue to all my Dadoes and Rabbets and start putting my pieces together. For a glue up like this, I like to do as much pre-planning as possible. I label all my pieces and get all my clamps close by, so that when the glue finally touches the wood, I can focus on assembly and not on problem solving. I add clamps and check periodically to make sure all my parts are square. The next day after the glue is dry, I pull the clamps off and start the process of edge banding the rest of the bench. This project is the first time I've ever used edge banding. In the past, I've either built using hardwood, left the plywood edges exposed, or glued on a 1/4-inch piece of hardwood to the edge of the plywood. I'm a big fan of all of these, and I'll definitely use them all again, but I've always been against the idea of edge banding without ever trying it for myself, so I wanted to give it a shot. This project is going to be painted, so most of the edge banding won't ever be seen, but painting exposed plywood edges doesn't always look great. The edges suck up a lot of paint, and the layer lines of the plywood can often be seen through the painted surface. The edge banding installed easily and stuck down without any problems. So far, I have nothing bad to say about this process. Everything is holding up well and looks nice enough to paint or to leave exposed. But if I ever have any problems with delamination or anything else, I will make sure to share it. This trimming tool I found in the same aisle as the edge banding worked great too. It was around $15 and well worth it. I trim up the corners with an X-Acto knife and hand sand the edges. Before moving on, I need to trim the top and bottom of the bench flush with its sides. To do this, I'm going to use a flush trim bit with my router. Making cuts like this, I like to leave them between a 1/16 and an 1/8 inch long, and then trim them to size after. With the carcass done, I move on to the doors. I start by ripping down a strip of 1/2 inch plywood, then breaking it down equally into 3 parts. The inside of my bench is 46.5 inches long, and instead of cutting my door blanks to equal this length, I cut them slightly larger, at 17 inches apiece. This way, when installed, they will overlap each other slightly. To make these 1/2 inch thick doors fit into the 1/4 inch grooves of the bench, I'm adding a rabbet to the top and bottom of each door. I cut the bottom rabbet first. I set my blade to a 1/4 inch high and set the fence so the outside of my blade is 3/16 of an inch from the fence. I run all my boards through then move the fence closer to the blade to clean up the rest of the material. This will cause my doors to set a 1/16 of an inch above the bottom of the bench and reduce friction when sliding. To determine where to start the top rabbet, I measure the opening of the bench from top to bottom and subtract 1/4 of an inch. Whatever that number is the distance I set my table saw's fence away from the blade. Now that we know where our rabbet starts, we need to remove the rest of the material between it and the edge of the board. To do this, I move the fence 1/8 of an inch at a time away from the blade and make a cut at each of these intervals. Once my rabbet reaches the edge, I clean it up with a chisel and try to fit it into place. But at this point, the top rabbet is too long to allow the door to slide into place. I trim the top rabbet down 1/8 of an inch at a time until the bottom door is able to clear the edge of the bench and drop into its track. I slide the door in place to check for sticking points and sand to remove them. Once I have all 3 doors installed and sliding well, I can move on to the aesthetic aspect of these doors. Lately, I've been interested in the idea of slatted doors, and I thought this project could be a good fit for them. My first step was to find the exact center point of each door. And this point being exactly centered is important. If it's not, the spacing between each of the slats won't be uniform. Once you find your center point, and your first cut is made on all 3 doors, take a very accurate measurement of what your fence is set to, and then move at a distance of your choice. This distance will determine how large your slats are and can be whatever you think looks good. But for me, I wanted a distance that would be as easily repeatable as possible. I went with 3/8 inch slats because this, added to the 1/8 inch thickness of my blade, meant that I would move my fence a 1/2 inch for every cut. I like this because a 1/2 inch is easy to add to any number, and you're going to have to keep adding it every time you move your fence. My center point was at 8 7/16 of an inch, which for me is a hard number to add things to, but the 1/2 inch spacing made it simple. My next stop was at 8 15/16, then 9 7/16, then 9 15/16, and so on and so on. And remember, at each stop of your fence, you're making 6 cuts. Make your first pass, then flip your door 180 degrees and make your second. Then do the same thing to both of your other doors. Then move your fence and repeat this process until you've reached the edge of each door. I'm again going with integrated door handles for these sliding doors. And for this project, I knew I wanted handles that were at the top of each door, centered on that door, angular, and easily repeatable. I decided a 45-degree angle was as good as any, and that meant that I could use my speed square clamped to the edge of my door as a guide for my jigsaw. And as long as I set the top of the square to the 6th slat each time, I could have cuts that were centered and easily repeatable. After making my 2 cuts, I freehand cut the material out of the center. I used the slat already in the door as my reference for a straight line. Then I cleaned up these cuts with a chisel and some sandpaper. I then finally replaced all the doors in the bench to make sure the horizontal slats lined up and that the door handles would open the doors. At this point, I'm ready to move on to finishing, and the first step was to sand the carcass as well as the doors to 220 grit using my orbital sander. I broke the edges of each slat by hand so that they wouldn't splinter over time. I then added 2 coats of oil-based satin polyurethane to the inside of the bench. And hand sanded with 320 grit after each coat. I wiped everything down and got ready to paint. I taped off the inside of the cabinet, poured my paint, and applied it using a fine finish roller. I'm using a Benjamin Moore paint from their advanced line that's made for high-use surfaces like cabinets. We chose this color called Seedling. The top, bottom, and sides of this bench all won't be seen, but I still chose to paint them. My rationality was that this way they would be protected from any moisture in the area, but in reality, I wasn't really confident in my painting skills, and this gave me an opportunity to practice before painting something that will get seen. I painted the doors and the face of the bench with 2 coats and sanded after the first coat had dried to remove any air bubbles left behind by my roller. I pulled the tape off the bench, added some paste wax to my doors, and put them back into place. And this is where we're going to leave this project for now. We're so excited to get it installed in the new mudroom, but first we need to build 2 cabinets that will go next to this bench, as well as a walnut countertop and matching bench top, which we'll be making in the next video. But for now, I am so happy with how this bench came out, and I really think the slatted doors add something to it. But I'd love to know your thoughts, because this was just one way to make a built-in bench. So feel free to leave those in the comments or over on Instagram. And as always, thanks so much for watching.